It's Friday, Feedback Friday, the feedbackiest day of the week. It's Feedback Friday. On a kind of damp and a little chilly Friday for me. Well, yesterday, Thursday, but it airs on Friday. But yeah, I'll take the cool after the heat from last week. But you guys are watching from around the world, so this means nothing to you. I got to amalgamate the responses, but hopefully I do it in an okay way. There were actually useful comments from all three videos this week, and it's like, where do I draw the line? Good problem to have, right? To have a comment section so good that you're like, where do you draw the line? This week I also shared something really personal with the patrons. I shared my personal background losing people to terrorism regarding stuff that, problems overseas that came to Canada. And I'm not going to talk about that in public because people are cruel. And the nice thing about having a Patreon community is that these are people who support me, that I can be full disclosure with that group in a way, I can't be online for with everything for obvious reasons. So, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, or if you appreciate the disclosure, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K. I do admit that it was nice to tell someone about the underlying conditions so I could at least let someone know, no, it's not all the things that people are claiming about me. It never is. But we're not going to start there. We're going to start. The stuff on the Uncharted movie video was interesting. I thought that was just going to be a throwaway video that nobody was going to care about. It did okay. But people answered my gun question about the pistol and the shotgun. And as I suspected, you can't really operate a shotgun like that one-handed, even though it is pistol grip, because when it's pump action, you can't rechamber it. But also apparently if you don't have a stabilizer, you wouldn't really hit anything and it wouldn't be safe to operate. What one person said is you'd have to fire the pistol with your off hand, then drop it, and then use the shotgun. This is why we say video games aren't real, right? It looks cool. It doesn't exactly operate cool, but I thought I'm glad I asked instead of just assuming, because I have a basic understanding of firearms and how they work. I find the technology fascinating, but I'm not a gun owner. I'm not a gun expert. I prefer to leave it up to people who know more than me. Amazing how that works, right? When I have a limitation here. So I'm not going to have a super strong opinion. I'm going to ask. How funny. How novel. Some of the comments in Wellness Wednesday this week, I'm going to take up in future videos because people said, hey, there's a topic for this. But one I thought was applicable to more people who watched Feedback Friday was the difference between accountability and guilt. There's actually a third element to that I didn't mention because it was sort of offhand, but the difference between accountability, guilt, and shame, right? A lot of times when you're making something like a video game, things happen. You can't control them. Things don't go your way. There's no point in feeling guilty about it. There's no point in being ashamed about it. You go, yep, we can do better next time. We can take this and build on it. That's a good bit of feedback. You're right. We can do better there. That's accountability. Guilt is when you feel bad about something. You feel blamed. Like you feel internally, yeah, that was my fault. I feel awful about that. That's guilt. Guilt can sometimes be totally misplaced, and when it's misplaced, it can be very bad for your mental health. Some guilt sometimes is okay, because guilt, you can learn from it. Oh, wow, I feel really bad that I did that. I'm not going to do that again, right? Shame is something different. Shame is stuff that people run from. Apparently, shame is really heavily involved in cycles of domestic abuse. Apparently one of the motivators for like serial killers is shame and avoiding shame, things like that. Interesting stuff, but shame is toxic. And I think a lot of people in gaming are dealing with a lot of shame. And certainly what I heard with the first video about what's it going to take, how are you going to feel heard, shame factored into that a lot. And it's one of those things where I'm pausing because it is so simple to identify what's wrong here. And it makes complete sense. People don't want to be shamed. Solving the problem is more complicated because the shame is coming from so many sources. But, it's important to identify the problem so we can find a solution to the problem. I will be able to identify the problem essentially in this video. Solving the problem is going to take work, and I fully guarantee I don't have all the answers. And I recognize that without a holistic approach to this shame problem, that, okay, well, if somebody's getting less shame here, but if they're still getting shamed over here, if they're traumatized from the shame, things aren't going to get better, because little bits of re-traumatization, sometimes people can't overcome that when they've been pushed down too hard, right? So I'll get into it with that caveat from the beginning. Jake Guys had an interesting opinion on this. Said, totally agree that a lot of people are feeling stifled out of fear, and that my hypothesis is that it's because people have failed to be taught, in the last 2 generations anyway, to disagree neutrally. I vehemently disagree with people sometimes, but I think it's from a place of ignorance. I don't jump down their throat. I ask them follow-up questions. This is, of course, in-person discussions, as social media makes it a lot harder to continue a discourse past the first treat and roughly 3-4 responses. And that's really true. But Jake continues, if people stopped assuming that a single limited post or tweet is the end of a thought process and instead treat it like a headline to be delved into more detail, it would save a lot of heartache and pain. It's like, that's actually a good rule. Tweets are sort of headlines, and it's very strange to me. It's always been strange to me when people take certain tweets and clip them and share them and take them out of context and, oh, look at that, and they frame it. And they frame it in a way because it's their headline being added on the other headline, and people are like, oh, look what this person did. They are clearly doing this. And because that's in the person's mind now, when they read the original tweet, they're more inclined, they're more framed to see that interpretation instead of being allowed to come to it on their own. I think that's incredibly toxic on the internet. It gets a lot of people dogpiled for not great reasons. I'll move on with Jake's comment. I'll stop it there because I talk about this a lot. Finally, the WSCM, I so love that catches on WSCM. White, straight, cisgendered male. Straw man. Used in a lot of social discourse, is annoying solely because it is usually talking about American WSCM. And even then, someone from Ohio will have a greatly different life experience to someone in New York. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, when I teach gender in gaming, I teach about the fact, the problems with the male gaze, that it's racist, it's heteronormative, it flattens the experiences of, 50% of the population into a single opinion set. And one of the things I learned in television, working in TV, is that the male gaze doesn't actually satisfy most men. One of the things I did in TV was we did a show. There was a hot tub long before Twitch. And we had dancing girls, and it was a Friday night catharsis programming, right? Like, that's what people want. Well, at least they did back in the 90s and 2000s. I started going, when I started the show, coming out of, coming in as a feminist, as a media feminist, I was like, well, these are all skinny white girls. Nothing wrong with a skinny white girl, but why is it only skinny white girls? And so we got a greater variety of women on the show. It wasn't just what you'd expect. It was, we brought the thick before thick was a term. We had Asian girls. We had, West Indian girls, Caribbean girls. We had East Indian girls. Those were difficult. It was difficult to get South Asian people because of the immigrant waves and the family disapproval at the time. But we did. We got a young lady that went on to be Miss Pakistan World. We just threw everything out the wall, and the bigger girls, the fluffier girls, the thick, they were more popular. And like the enthusiasm for those women was far more, because you got the guy going, oh yeah, that's stroking my ego, as opposed to, oh, that's hot, and maybe it was just because the people who were interested in thick women weren't being catered to by television, but that indicates there isn't a single male gaze. There just isn't. So why are we using this tool that stuffs all men incorrectly, invalidly in the same freaking box and blaming them for what's going on in media when it's really just about what's the most expensive way a person can look? We're going to make that the trendy thing to sell products. That's what it's about. And so I would be more than happy if the whole male gaze thing was just thrown out whole cloth, and recognized that this idea of one man behind the lens of a camera being able to represent all men everywhere, same with all women, same with, non-binary people, that's absurd. If anything, let's call it the Hollywood gaze, because that's what it is, right? I just, more and more, the more I work with it, the more I break it down, it seems like the male gaze is actually a very counterintuitive idea, because it's compounding the idea that set of things, skinny white girl with no ass, fake boobs, and really long hair, that's what all guys everywhere want. And that's just not true. So, it could be started there. Another comment from the Uncharted video was, first of all, the whole thing, you guys like the I have 2 first names and 2 last names quip. I'm glad you like that. I came up with that at a time. I'm just so mad at the New York Times of late. Some people mentioned with the prequel angle, and I think this is less of a disagreement and more of just like a different way of looking at it, that yes, there has never been a story with Nate in his 20s from Uncharted. That's true, because he was a kid in the first game. But that's not what the article said. The article said there had never been prequels explored. It is not actually an origin story, like it claims, if he's in his 20s. Because we already saw Nate and Sully's first meeting in the Uncharted games. So prequel, fine, more like interquel, quite frankly. But I still maintain that was less than accurate. And I think if you're going to sneer at video games, you better be accurate, because as commenters pointed out, the Sonic movie made a lot of money. I'm not sure why. I guess raw profits. I don't know why that was left out of that piece. I don't know why they went with Detective Pikachu instead of Sonic. Maybe they didn't think to check it because the response to the original digital Sonic character was so bad, but clearly people saw the movie anyway. Now we get into the whole thing about feeling heard. And Atamamon, I hope I got that right. Atamamon, I'm terrible with these screen names, but they say, I think feeling heard is just the shorthand for what people actually want, which is closer to, I want what I say to matter to the people who can do something about what I'm upset about. I'm like, okay, interesting distinction. Being able to express things in a safe environment is important, certainly, but the anger people feel towards gaming journalists or game devs for failing to create or support particular games or ideas seems to indicate that the actual problem is the lack of perceived positive outcome as a direct result of what they're saying. As a side note to this, I think in gaming there's a lot of brattiness on all sides where many problems have already been addressed, but people have blinders on so they won't acknowledge any solution that doesn't come from what they consider to be a prestigious enough source. It doesn't matter how many black female main characters exist in gaming. The entire industry is white supremacy until Red Dead Redemption 3 is announced with one and she's also physically disabled in some way. It doesn't matter how widely available H games are. They're not available on PSN, then the gaming community hates all expressions of male sexuality. I just think people could afford to chill out a bit if they were interested in that. I thought it was, yes, I do think there's some elitism going on. The right people have to say the right things for it to count. And I think that in order to solve this problem, that has to lessen. Instead of, we want the people currently in power to advocate for our view. It's got to be more, we're going to support and elevate the people we think make better points. Because the people who are in power now, they're not changing. For me, a big part structurally about the gaming sites is, the same people are in charge of these sites as were in charge. When I was starting in games far too many years ago, you see a lot of the same names. There's no movement. There's a staleness in vision. And that's because there's nowhere for people to go. They can't change jobs without taking a pay cut. The only place to go from games journalism is into actually writing games. And for a lot of these guys that have been there for too long, they got families, right? They got mortgages. They can't take the pay cut. And so they're stale and bitter. And what we do about it is, multi-prong in that case. I do think it was an interesting observation that feeling heard is not the same as something being done about what you say. I think there's some overlap in that being heard doesn't just mean you get to scream at someone. It means you actually feel understood, right? What I took from a collection of comments, tying in the male gaze, tying in, that kind of thing, not enough positive outcomes, is that the problem isn't that things are being made without WSCMs, white, straight, cisgender men, front and center for white, straight, cisgender men. The problem seems to be, based on the comments I read, that white, straight, cisgender men are being actively demonized as the source of the problem, every single one of them. And I have been hearing that for years now. That's what I was hearing back in 2014. That's what I'm hearing now. And people think they'll solve the problem by just telling these guys who feel demonized, who feel blamed unfairly, no, you're not. That doesn't work. People are expressing intense shame. People are reacting to the shame tactics. And that's totally fair. You can't blame every white guy for, the 4 or 5 white guys that run the gaming websites. They have no say, right? And as Jake pointed out, European men have a different take on things and different parts of Europe have different takes on things, right? Opinion is not the same in France as Germany as England. I've regular viewers from all those places. So it's yeah, I see the difference in perspective. Even parts of England, but North Ireland versus Ireland, not the same, right? This flattening of the male experience, this flattening of male opinion is just, the results are disastrous. And like, I'm tying in the whole male gaze thing, I'm tying in the shame thing. That seems to be, pardon the pun, the nut of this thing. Make that dirty. People are fine if you want to make a game about a black transgender lesbian amputee, right? Who may also be partially, hearing impaired, whatever. They don't care. They're good. Awesome. If it's a good game, they'll play it, right? It's when white men who feel quite powerless right now because the recession before this one, the economic pain before this last round predominantly hit working age men. Now, COVID hit women harder. So maybe we'll see a bit of a balancing of the scales right now, but I don't find when people all lose together that works. That's when you get infighting, because this person feels aggrieved and this person feels aggrieved. And guess what? They're right to feel aggrieved, but instead of fighting with the people who did it, they're fighting with each other. Economic issues tend to be heralds of social upheaval. The 60s happened when the let's create a fake nicey post-war reality for men coming back from the front lines started to falter, when they started running out of money for all those programs and inflation went through the roof. That's when you started getting culture clashes. And some really good stuff came out of those culture clashes, right? But I mean, the women that were forced out of work to make room for the men coming back, well, that led to second wave feminism, right? And the, people of color who were just steamrolled right over because the benefits for black veterans were nowhere near on the keel of the white veterans. Well, you got the Black Civil Rights Movement. And obviously those movements are incomplete. They continue to this day. But now we've got things like high unemployment, high poverty, and the opioid addiction crisis in poor white America. Up here, we have the loss of oil and gas jobs in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I know you guys can't be expected to know Canadian politics, but this was a social engineering experiment gone wrong. Stephen Harper, our Bibi Netanyahu, okay, the guy was in power for 10 years, predominantly in minority situations, because he was never elected to a majority. The 2-term kind of standard never hit him. We don't have term limits for PMs here, but most only go 2. Refresh, get somebody new in there. But because Harper never had the full 4-year term, that never really applied to him. So he went 10 freaking years. And Harper's plan was to basically not help the Ontario economy at all. Let it fester so that people would move out to Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are conservative voting strongholds, for work. More people moving out, population move from Ontario to Saskatchewan and Alberta means Ontario gets fewer seats in Parliament and Alberta and Saskatchewan get more seats in Parliament. Now, the big difference between Canada and the US is we don't directly vote for a prime minister. Our prime minister is just the person leading the party who gets the most seats in the election. So Harper figured he would engineer conservative advantages by moving people to conservative strongholds. Well, a bunch of factors, including the fact that it's oil sands in Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are very expensive and to refine and terrible on the environment. They're less desirable because they're more expensive than sweet crude stocks, which are easier to get out of the ground and refine. And so when oil drops or there's a ton of cleaner supplies of oil, the jobs dry up. And guess what happened? They've got serious problems in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So those people feel incredibly aggrieved. That's where we see our biggest, anti-mask, anti-vaccine, white supremacy is kind of spread around the country, but there are pockets out there. These things connect. The same way poverty and gang activity are connected. Poverty and white supremacy are connected. These militias and stuff like that. You give these guys a job, you give them back their dignity, they'll stop blaming everybody else because they don't have very much to blame them for. And we can't do anything about that regarding games, except understand it. People are like, but, black people have it worse. Yes, the black employment issue in the US, to a lesser extent in Canada, is worse. But when you don't have a job that pays enough to make your bills, the hard fact is you don't care who else doesn't. All you care is that you don't. The survival brain kicks in, the panic brain kicks in, and it's all about who gets to you first with a lifeline to tell you it's not your fault, to take away the shame. And for a lot of these guys, it's white supremacist groups, right? That's the way it works. Understanding this really helps you be kind to people to an extent. Nobody has an unending well of kindness in them. But understanding this stuff helps a lot when you're dealing with people who are in that hole, right? And Viennicus Prime commented not quite in the same way, but he said, people in a crowd can feel the most alone. The internet has amplified this feeling to the nth degree. Twitter is really just a huge crowd. Really getting on social media as a thrust and large crowd that is the entire world. This means you're now dealing with all of society that you're now you're dealing with all of society. So it's not only what gets liked and disliked, but also who likes and dislikes what you have to say and how many likes and dislikes that you get. For some people, when they feel they have a profound truth that only few people in the entire world are hearing, it makes them feel small. For others, having to truncate your post because of character limits to the increasingly short attention span of everyone is disheartening. After all, brevity is the only soul of wit. Brevity is only the soul of wit if you can completely convey your idea. And for even others, it can feel lopsided simply in the fact that everyone gets inundated by what other people say compared to what they say. Now, two things here. One is I remember the first year I went to E3 and it really did make me feel small, not because of the sea of people, because when you first walk in, you're like, wow, I'm a part of something. And then you go to your first appointment. And when they don't know you, the shitty treatment starts. And that's when you feel small. When you get squashed like a bug at every check-in station, that's when you feel small. And that's when people start to get bitter. And I think social media is a similar experience to that. Some commenters responded to Viennicus that Twitter isn't the whole world. That only like 22% of Americans are on Twitter. And 80% of all Twitter activity is generated by the top 10% of power users. And they tend to not represent America as a whole. They're more likely to be college educated. They're more likely to be liberal, very liberal, and so on and so forth. And it's true that the popular opinion on social media, especially Twitter, the popular opinion on social media does not line up with the world at large. If you'd looked at social media of late, you'd swear that, people in general far favor the Palestinians over the Israelis and are super cool, like totally down with, trans athletes competing in sports in their their gender, their affirmed gender. Neither is true. The Palestinians only have 30% approval ratings in most of America. The support for Palestinian statehood is a majority, a small majority. But whose side are you on question? Do you favor the Israelis or the Palestinians? Israel more than 2-1. You wouldn't know that from Twitter. The trans athlete question just came out. While a majority of Americans are great with trans people in the military, the trans and sport issue is going to take more work. Now, I say this as somebody who is supportive of trans athletes in sport. I'm not convinced it's so obvious that they have an unfair advantage. And let's face it, we're talking about kids in middle school and high school, possibly college, not elite Olympic athletes, right? But that's not a popular issue in the US. Now, just because I am in support of that particular issue, can I just ignore that it's an unpopular stance? No, I can't. And these are the things that we have to keep in mind when we use Twitter as a window into the world. And that's why it's very important to have one-on-one conversations. And that's why I wish that we could bring back the Zoom parties without people feeling... The big problem was that people felt like some people were dominating the conversations and they wanted a bunch of rules because they felt like they couldn't speak. And I'm like, the whole point of this was that I didn't have to play list mom all the time. So we're going to have to figure this out. But I do think there needs to be something that is a forum that I just haven't figured out the system, but it does seem, I mean, one of the things that a lot of people said is we need a viable alternative to Kotaku, Polygon, IGN, and GameSpot. I think a couple of those sites would have to amalgamate or fail before another competitor comes up, because in a space, you start running out of advertising dollars. But it might be able to happen. Media in general is going to change. I feel I'm getting the sense that there's a lot more understanding that we have to go back to a paradigm of moderation. They're just trying to figure out how to do that and get clicks. We'll see. Maybe after the midterms in the US, if Biden can put on a strong enough showing, as a leader. I think he's doing a pretty good job right now being a moderate. But he has to keep that up, and maybe things will start settling down. But I don't know. The internet is a playground for extremists, and we'll keep talking, right? I mean, like I said off the top of this video, I don't have solutions, but I think identifying the problem is a great place to start, right? And the thing about, you can take white men and replace it for anyone else. Everybody's feeling the same way. Which is why everybody's having a hard time believing that all these other people that from the outside look to be doing just great, thank you very much, are struggling as well. We need fewer people struggling as much as they are. Overall, high tide raises all boats for this to get better. Now, how we do that, I have no idea. And we're not going to solve this problem today. So if you like this sort of analysis, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/AnnaK. Thanks for watching.